Hi, hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cynthia if you are new here, and today I'm very excited. We are going to be talking about The Crimson Moth by Kristen Ciccarelli, and this book is one that I have been thinking about since I read it a few months ago. So I read this book in the spring. I listened to the audiobook version, which I definitely recommend. The narrator was chef's kiss. It's a story that I still think about, and I cannot wait for the second book. I will be very unwell until January 2025, which I believe is when the second book comes out. So if I'm wrong, just like insert the correct publishing date, and I will be unwell until that date. I don't really have too much housekeeping other than these are my opinions. I really liked this book, so if you didn't like this book, maybe click off the video. It's fine. With that being said, let's just jump right in. So in summary, Heartless Hunter is a book about our main character, Rune, who is a witch. And witches used to be very powerful. They used to hold powers of position. They used to be very well known in society, but now they are outcast. There was a revolution. It wiped out a lot of the witches, and a lot of the remaining witches have left because they are essentially being hunted. Like, witches are not welcome. And so a lot of the witches that survived the revolution are either they stayed, but they're in hiding, or they have fled. But Rune, our main character, is kind of like a double agent. She's this young, stupid socialite by day, and by night she goes by the Crimson Moth. And the Crimson Moth is essentially the witch vigilante who saves her fellow witches from being purged or killed. But during one of her missions, it kind of goes sideways, and this is where we meet one of our love interests, Gideon. Gideon, of course, has to be a witch hunter. And at first he's not really interested in Rune. He thinks she's just this like vapid socialite. And he's like, listen, you're cute, but like, I got things to do. Until he discovers that it is Rune's merchant ships that the Crimson Moth has been using to help witches flee and whatnot. So at that point, Gideon's like, hold up, there's something more going on with Rune. But the problem is that while they're both trying to play cat and mouse with each other, they're also falling in love with each other. So let's get into thoughts on the plot. So right off the bat, this book is very, very character driven. There is a plot. It's kind of small, but there are semblances of it throughout the book. There's also a love triangle in this book, which I wasn't really a fan of, but that's more or less because I'm not a fan of love triangles, and the way this love triangle was handled was an absolute no. That is not how you end a love triangle. I'm just gonna say that, and I'm not gonna bring it up again because I'm still very upset about that. And if you read this book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But despite my dislike for love triangles, I will say I did like the romance in this book. The romance in this book exists primarily between Gideon and Rune. Gideon is our witch hunter. Rune is our vigilante witch. And then there is Alex. Alex is Gideon's brother who just kind of wants Rune to leave with him so they can just live a quiet, safe life together. And Alex knows that Rune is a witch. Gideon does not. It's a very interesting dynamic that plays out, and depending on what kind of, I guess, attitude you bring to the situation, who you like more for Rune is gonna vary. Because there's not really a straight enemies to lovers. Like, Gideon and Rune they're not enemies. Like, not really. I don't know how to describe it. The two dynamics kind of at play. Like with Alex, it's kind of like a friends to lovers trope, and with Gideon, it's more of like a hunter slash hunted kind of dynamic. A little bit more cat and mouse, I would say. They are technically enemies. You know, he's a witch hunter, she's a witch. They're enemies, but I don't want to classify it as a true enemies to lovers because neither really knows what the other is. Like, Rune knows that Gideon is a witch hunter, but Gideon really struggles to prove that Rune is a witch. So do with that what you will, to be honest. Just do with that what you will. Something that I also really enjoyed was the setting of this book. It was like Bridgerton meets magic. It was like Regency era type. It was like fantasy Regency romance. I don't know if that's a thing. If you read Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, kind of think that book minus like the sneaky fae, but with a little more spice. Because this book does have a spicy open door scene. It's not too heavy-handed, but it exists. It was nice. And I also really enjoyed the fact that, and it's kind of a weird thing, like now that I think about it, because I'm like, oh, I liked this. And I'm like, it's kind of a mute point, I guess, but I liked that the magic came with a price. Like, you couldn't just do magic because you were a witch. Like, Rune couldn't just use her magic simply because she was a witch. She had to pay a price in order to use her magic. Or if she used too much of her magic, she risked burning out and even killing herself. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of like layer on top of everything else. And I found that I liked it because there's some fantasy romance stories. No, I shouldn't say some. There are a lot of fantasy stories where the characters just are constantly using streams of power with absolutely no consequences. And yes, it's fantasy. It's not supposed to be realistic. Doesn't everything come with a cost? I will also say, if you pay attention to the plot while reading this book and you don't just get completely invested in the characters, the plot twists are kind of obvious. I definitely could have figured it out sooner if I wasn't so curious about other aspects of the book. I will warn you, the ending of this book is a cliffhanger, and it is rough. Like, I visualized so clearly the ending of the book while I was reading it, and I think about it all the time. I'm just like, I need the second book. So just be warned, if you're someone who's kind of at the point where you're like, I can't do any more cliffhangers, I gotta wait till the second book is out so I can read the first book and jump right into the second book, just know that this one, the ending is a little rough. It's fantastic for an ending, but it's a little rough. Okay, now on to the real stars of this book, which are the characters. Obviously, we have our girl Rune. She's very fascinating, and like I said in the kind of like summarizing this book, she's this like socialite by day, Crimson Moth vigilante by night. She has this kind of like dual life personality going on, and it's really, really interesting. I will say, if there were any kind of like disappointments, it would be that we didn't get more of the Crimson Moth. I think what happened was the romance played so much more of a bigger and pivotal role in this book, that with the romance taking up so much space, we kind of lost some of those like Crimson Moth elements, which was kind of disappointing. I really wanted more Crimson Moth. I was so fascinated by Rune as the Crimson Moth that it was a little like, oh. But like I also mentioned earlier, Gideon and Alex are brothers who make up the other half, or the other two corners of the love triangle. And they're both very fascinating in their own ways. Gideon is very hard and sharp, and he's very dedicated to getting rid of the witches, and he's very like on his game. Whereas Alex is a little more soft-spoken and caring, and he's a little bit, I feel like Alex would definitely be a big fan of slow living, if that makes sense. I feel like Alex would live on a cottage with some animals, and he would just kind of like live his life, and that would be that. Whereas Gideon kind of feels more city. He's a little more fast-paced. He's very into his job and his work, and he's very dedicated. They have a very interesting dynamic, even as brothers. But I do like them. I do like both of them as characters. And like I said, there's also the fake dating trope with Gideon and Rune, because Gideon is hunting the Crimson Moth, and Rune is the Crimson Moth. And like I mentioned earlier, Alex is fully aware of this fact about Rune, and that's why he's very much like, let's just leave, let's just go, let's go live our lives in peace elsewhere where they don't care about witches. I think Rune has a hard time with just being like, yes, let's go, because she's also dedicated to her sister witches and she wants to do right by them, whereas Gideon is, you know, kind of part of the force that's hunting them down. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that forms between these three main characters. It is an open door spicy scene. It's not super explicit. Like, it's not A Court of Mist and Fury explicit. It is open door. We are very much aware of what's happening. So I'm not really sure why this is marketed as young adult. Keep that in mind if you're not into that. We do have some side characters, but honestly, I don't care about them. I'm sorry. Is the truth. Like, we have some side characters. I don't care. And our storyline with the antagonist Cressida, which, why is every mean girl in Regency era stories named Cressida? Our storylines that involved the antagonist Cressida and and other kind of like side characters, as well as some of our main characters with things in the past, really shed light on like some people's motivations, which I thought was interesting. I know that's very vague, but if you've read the book, you'll probably know what I mean. But all in all, this book, no, not this book, the angst in this book, the intrigue in this book, the will they, won't they, hunter, hunted, slow burn tension of this book had me in a complete chokehold the whole time. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, I think if you're paying attention to some of like the other like smaller points that are happening and being noted, the plot twist really isn't that much of a twist. It was a little more of a twist for me because there are some points where I was like, that's weird, I should remember that. But then I would get so wrapped up in like other things in the book that by the time the plot twist happened, I was like, oh. And to be honest, despite some like minor disappointments, like I really hated how the love triangle ended. I really hated that we didn't get as much Crimson Moth as we definitely could have. But all in all, I genuinely loved the magic in this book. I loved the setting. I loved the world. I just loved so many elements of this book. There were more things that I liked than I disliked. And so 4 stars out of 5 stars for Heartless Hunter. If I'm being honest, now that I've had some time to let it settle, I'd probably say 4.5 stars out of 5 stars because I genuinely enjoyed this story. And if a friend asked me if they would read it, I'd be like, yes. Why are you asking me? Go read it. Yes. This is a book that I would absolutely recommend. But again, if you're more of a closed door girly, or you're just not into spice, or you're too young to be reading spice, I would either skip this one or skip the scene that happens later on in the book. You'll know when you get there. Just skip to the next chapter. Because what follows is very dramatic and really kind of sets the ending of the book in motion. So it was a very fun read. And like I said, I listened to the audiobook and I really enjoyed the narrator, but now it's also on Kindle Unlimited. I borrowed the audiobook from my library, but if you have a Kindle Unlimited subscription, you could also read it there. So I'm going to leave it at my original rating of 4 stars out of 5 stars for Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye.